All right. Well, welcome everyone. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but I'm gonna cut to the chase and bring in our speaker. First of all, I want to say he is an amazing individual. Highly respect him. He is a physician. There's very few people in the world that I can actually call and talk shop as far as medicine and bringing in AI together. He's got immense information as far as how to get through the FDA. He really understands computer language, AI, machine learning. Actually, his company can program. So I'm just really thrilled to have him here.
Great. Well, hey, yeah, definitely thanks a lot, Harvey. I would also say the same thing about you. I'm just super impressed at, how you're just able to keep up to date with all of the crazy advancements that have been going on. I mean, it seems like it probably is a full-time job just keeping up with all the generative AI stuff, and this field is moving so quickly. So definitely thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for the audience for giving me your time slice of your day. So let me start out by sharing my screen here and do a quick technical check. So check number one, do you see my screen? Do you see my cursor?
Yes, yes, sir.
Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
So I think now we have a multimodal presentation going on here. It's great. So just real quick about me. So my name is Yujan Shrestha. I am an MD. I've also been practicing software engineering in the med device industry for about the last 12 years. And for those 6 years, I've been doing a lot of machine learning and AI, everything from training my own models to hand building my own machine learning servers and also getting these models FDA cleared, managing teams that are both from the machine learning side and also data science side, and also a team of regulatory experts as well. So in these last 6 years, I think I've seen at a distance and also up close that how the FDA has kind of brought into their thought process on a new emerging technology like this. This most recent deep neural network revolution, I would say, for about the last 6 or 7 years, has really started to take off and has put AI kind of into the limelight. So I've seen that process, how that unfolded. And what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is to try to extrapolate what I've seen from that into where I think it's going into the future. Generative AI, as you all know, is now the new hot thing, when maybe 6 years ago it was convolutional neural networks. But I think there's a lot we can learn from how the FDA approached the convolutional neural network phase to now how they may go into the future. And here's some of the clients I've worked with. So I've definitely seen projects and seen how the industry works. So I hope I'll have something interesting for you guys to learn today. And so my company, we actually write software for software as a medical device. That's our focus. We do a lot of machine learning. We also help our clients get through FDA. So if you ever need software development and also FDA experience for that truly end-to-end service, we can definitely help you out there. I'd be happy to learn more about your product. So what's the scope of this conversation? So if it doesn't interest you, you don't have to give me an hour of your time. Today, I want to talk about what the FDA's current stance is on what I'm calling non-generative AI, and I'll go more into the actual terms a little bit later. But I want to go into their current stance and try to extrapolate into the future. I'm only limiting the scope of this conversation to topics pertaining to med devices, and I'll also be talking about what's not considered a med device. But I'm not going to be going into many details about the numerous use cases of generative AI for like education or for improving research or drug discovery, or I'm not going to go into those. I'm not saying that there aren't these many scopes. I'm just not talking about them today. And also, I would like to kind of put some caveats here, is that the nature of this extrapolative exercise, there will be my own opinions. They're not opinions necessarily shared by my company, and there is no definitive stance, as far as I'm aware, from the FDA about generative AI. And your mileage may vary. If you take this advice, go to the FDA, your mileage may vary on kind of what you get. Um, Also, right now, the field is changing exponentially. I mean, from the time I prepared these slides to the time I'm presenting, actually new developments happen toward the end. So like I tried to keep the topics here kind of shelf stable, but that's a bit difficult to do in today's landscape for this topic. So I did a poll in LinkedIn and I asked the audience, how do you think generative AI would be regulated by FDA? I was surprised to see actually that the overall impression is very positive. And like only 6% said a hard no, that it would not be allowed in devices. And the vast and the majority of respondents said that a revamp of the regulations is required to get generative AI regulated, but that it will happen. And I appreciate the positive thinking. I'll kind of go into more details about what the FDA currently thinks now. Try not to include most of my opinions in here, but this is kind of the current state, the current snapshot of the overall impression, I think, of the med device industry. So for any productive conversation, I think the best thing to do first is to get the terminology and definitions out of the way, make sure we're talking about the same thing. AI is a extremely overused term, and it can mean different things to a lot of people. So in the most pedantic sense, AI is simply any technology that mimics human behavior. So this could be as simple as an if statement for Python, for example. Machine learning is a subset of AI where humans don't necessarily write code or write rules. We let the machine learn those rules on its own. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. And here's kind of an onion diagram showing how these items are truly related in their purest definition. Machine learning, subset of AI, deep neural network, subset of machine learning. Generative deep neural networks is yet a subset of deep neural networks. And then within that, we have large language models like ChatGPT. We have image-based models like diffusion models like DALL-E. And even recently, we have OpenAI's Sora, which I understand is kind of a combination of the two. So that's kind of the purest definition. But for the purposes of discussion, so it resonates with the most people, I'm going to use what the common vernacular terms are. So AI, when used in a conversation, typically refers to deep neural networks. Because of the exponential growth that kick-started this most recent revolution, maybe 6 years ago, the catalyst of that was deep neural networks. So whenever that took off, AI took off with it, and the two kind of became linked. So when I refer to AI, probably in common speaking, referring to deep neural networks. I'm also going to use non-generative AI to disambiguate it from generative AI, where non-generative AI is the current generation, or the previous generation, maybe you'll call it, where you have UNet CNNs, for example, that do segmentation and image processing tasks. And then we have generative AI, which I'm considering the most recent iteration of AI, where these are extremely large neural networks, extremely deep. ChatGPT is one example of that. And non-generative AI is the vast majority of AI that's currently deployed in medical devices is non-generative. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have generative capacity. It depends on how the machine learning algorithm is constructed. If they have an underlying representation of state that can be used to then generate new samples. Some of them do have generative capability, but as of now, it's that generative capability is typically not exercised when these algorithms are deployed in practice. So the non-generative AI machine learning algorithms typically have parameter counts that are in the millions of parameters. So you can think of these parameters as like tiny if-else statements, more or less. So a non-generative neural network has 1 million of these if-else statements. Maybe the largest program I ever wrote maybe has 1,000. So this is kind of getting into that scale to just kind of give you an idea. So these have been put into practice for several years, and over the years, I've seen the FDA's stance on AI slowly loosen, and they used to be extremely cautious, rightfully so. Whenever the new technology comes out, you want to know exactly what the failure modes are. You want to make sure that it's not going to give you some erroneous results that could result in patient harm. But over the years, now it seems like these non-generative machine learning models have become commonplace for FDA, and they have a lot of guidelines that if the medical device manufacturer responds to these guidelines, it's fairly likely that they're going to produce a safe and effective product. For example, it's a commonly known failure mode that if your AI is only trained on one institution, or it's only trained on one CT scanner, it's probably not going to generalize to other CT scanners in other institutions, and it'll fail in practice. So the FDA has this as one of their criteria. Every time you submit an FDA application with AI, almost assuredly they'll ask you this question, and for good reason. So generative AI, as I said, it is a subset of AI, subset of deep neural networks that can generate new data that is similar but not identical to the data on which they were trained. So things like ChatGPT, DALL-E, Sora, that's what I'm talking about. So these new cooperative algorithms are in the parameter counts of multi-billions, and even into the trillions. So we're talking 1,000 times larger scale, not just in terms of the model complexity and the size of the model, but also the data that has gone into the model. So perhaps this is my opinion, that perhaps the difference between generative and non-generative is just a matter of scale. Perhaps that generative AI is still interpolating. It's still doing an interpolation problem, but it's so complicated, it's so large that to us on the outside, it appears to be generating new data. I don't know where the research is on that. It kind of reminds me on the philosophical questions about free will. Like, is free will really just that the said organism is too complicated to explain, therefore it has free will? Maybe generative AI is kind of a similar thing. We think it's generating, but actually maybe it's doing the same thing that the previous generation is, just much more complicated, training a lot more data. So I also want to talk about what is a medical device. It may surprise you that software, even just software that doesn't include any hardware piece, that could be considered a actual medical device. It doesn't have to be a physical thing that you touch. A medical device is an instrument, apparatus, machine, contrivance, kind of a broad set of things that is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease and other conditions to cure, mitigate, treatment, prevention, disease in man and other animals. It's a pretty broad stroke. There are some provisions that I'll talk about later that I think are relevant to generative AI that makes key exceptions to these broad strokes. This is namely in section C, where C says that it's not a drug, and it's not a software function excluded pursuant section 520, which I will be going into a bit more detail later. But I wanted to get this definition of what is a medical device, because I was splitting this talk into two sections. The first section we're talking about, if you do think it's a medical device, if it is a device, then here's my current state of AI with FDA and my extrapolations. We'll talk about that fork. And the other branch to that is if you're trying to apply something with generative AI, how can you do it in a way that the FDA does not consider it a medical device? So I think those are two branches where you could get generative AI into the clinic, and you have to go into one of those two branches, and I'll talk about both of those. So for the medical device, so for the medical device route, whenever I submit something to FDA, what I like to tell my clients is there's really three questions that we need to answer fundamentally. And these three questions are: One, does your algorithm do what you claim it does? So if you have a sensitivity target, a specificity target, maybe you go as far as have a percent efficacy target, or any other marketing claims. You need to prove to the FDA that your device does what you claim it does. So that may be that may take part of like a clinical study you'll have to do, maybe all the way up to clinical trial, or it could just be a simple unit test or integration test, depending on how big of a claim you're making. Also, can you prove that the results are not derived by accident? So these are things like transparency in the algorithm. Can you break apart your algorithm into smaller components and show that, most likely if these components work and we have performance targets for these, that most likely our device isn't just spitting out true and false based on just random chance, right? Also, data augmentation, train test hygiene. So how well are you splitting your train and test data sets? If you're accidentally using your testing set and your training set, well, most likely you're getting your results by accident. And the third question is, will your algorithm work on unseen data? It's often called, will it generalize to unseen data? So the way you can add evidence to this is by using multi-institutional data, multi-vendor data, multi-ethnic data, to show the FDA that most likely, also given the risk of the device, most likely it is going to generalize to unseen data. And I suspect, even though this is currently for non-generative AI, this is what we're looking at. I suspect these principles probably would generalize to generative AI and any improvements coming in the future. So these principles are kind of three different vectors, if you will, that you need to consider. The magnitude of these vectors depends on these items here. So it's a risk-based approach. Like your burden of proof to the FDA depends on the risk of your intended use of this device. For example, if you want to use the device over the counter, so used by laypersons without any medical training, that is typically higher risk than if it's used by a healthcare provider. Let's call it HCP. If your device controls a hardware that is either invasive or will deposit energy into the patient, those are also higher risk. The more complicated your algorithm is, so the more parameters you have, kind of translates pretty well there, the higher risk of having unknown failure modes. And so your burden of proof will go up. Pediatric populations are higher risk than adult. Urgent intraoperative cases are higher risk because there's less chance for a physician to be able to double check those results. So more likely they're going to take it on face value. And the burden of proof scales up. So while these three principles still apply, for a high-risk device, what would have taken 100 patients in a study to prove, now that burden of proof might go up to 1,000 or might go up to 10,000. So that's the way that basically this works, is you have these three and you have modifiers that either increase the risk or decrease the risk that will determine. And it's not a precise science. There's ways to confirm with FDA for things like sample size, things like what the design of the study is. It's not a perfect science, but this kind of gives you a rule of thumb and gives you the levers that you can play with. So onto the model complexity standpoint, here's a graphic showing what we're dealing with. So way back before the current AI era, before convolutional neural nets basically were mainstream, we had handcrafted features. We had features like kurtosis, or we had features like how the tumors were shaped or what the textures were. And these would be then fed into stats models, and talking about maybe 1,000 parameters or so for something like that. Convolutional neural networks came around. These are the networks that you could train at home. You can train on your computer, on a nice gaming PC. Perhaps you could train something that would perform reasonably well. We're talking about the 10 million parameter mark. LLMs currently are still in the realm of only big tech companies could train those, and we're talking about the trillion level. So, and there doesn't seem to be a end to how much you can scale this. It seems like the more parameters you add, the better the model performs. So I suspect this curve to continue to increase. And you'll notice it's not linear. It is an exponential increase to this curve. So for a non-generative AI, typically what I've seen in practice is your study sample size in the hundreds to thousands of examples or patients would be enough to secure an FDA clearance for a moderate level risk machine learning device for the non-generative approach to AI. Generative AI, on the other hand, has 1,000 times more parameters. So there's 1,000 times more if-then else statements that could go wrong. And we've seen this. Like generative AI can fail in very mysterious ways. Like it can definitely hallucinate in ways that seem very confident but are completely wrong, right? And these failure modes are not well known and not understood because of that complexity. And my expectation is that the burden of proof will scale with the size of the model. I'm not sure if it's going to scale linearly, like do we need 1,000 times more data in order to cross that burden of proof, or is it 100 times more data? I'm not sure what that number is, but it definitely will go up with the number of parameters. So some other considerations that could make generative AI a little bit trickier, at least keep these things in mind. So frozen or locked models will make the FDA review process significantly easier. And that's because you can control those models. You don't want your medical device performing differently in the field than in your test environment, because you don't know if it's gonna work. You don't know how it's going to perform if you have a device like that. So frozen or locked models, like especially for example, Llama 2 is one model that can run offline. That's probably the safest way to ensure that the model is not going to change from under you. I do know that some of the larger generative AI products have like an enterprise version where they may be able to provide you some more guarantees that they're not going to change the model weights from underneath you. Also, some of the generative AI models have a way to turn on deterministic mode. It could be called different things. Some models call it temperature. Bing, for example, has like precise mode, has creative mode. For the purposes of medical devices, you want to be as precise and deterministic as possible. May or may not be possible for some crops of generative AI. And if it's non-deterministic, I think it'll be very difficult to get it cleared, because how can you be certain, like how can you cross the burden of proof, the threshold that your model will perform if it always performs differently in your test environment? So I think getting the models to be deterministic is probably a requirement at this point if you want to get FDA cleared, given that this is also going to be brand new. So far I'm aware there aren't any medical devices out there that use LLMs. And we actually did a pre-submission with the FDA where we presented a device that does use an LLM, and the FDA seemed to kind of corroborate my thought that there haven't been any LLM cleared devices yet. So therefore, any new devices going down this route probably will not be able to use the 510K route, which is the generally accepted to be the easiest way to get medical devices cleared here in the US. And they can't go down the 510K route because there is not a suitable predicate for that. Also, the FDA had indicated that synthetic data used to train the algorithm could be problematic in that you have to validate that the synthetic data is representative of real data. And that may be an entire, PhD thesis in and of itself. So it may be the case that using synthetic data, which is definitely has its place, I think, in research, but in terms of medical devices, it may be just better to use real data instead of trying to synthesize or augment too much your text-based data for large language models. So my thought on this is that the generative AI will start out kind of going back to this risk approach. The burden of proof is lowest where you minimize all of these parameters. So I think the generative AI that uses the fewest amount of parameters, I know that Llama 2 has like a 7 billion version, has a 13 billion version. These are probably gonna, like, we'll probably see use cases of those come out first because of the lower burden of proof. Probably healthcare provider driven algorithms will come out before medical devices come to the OTC market, LLMs. So I think minimizing these would reduce the barrier to entry to machine to FDA, and that's probably the self selective pressures we'll see. We'll probably see algorithms that kind of fall into these low risk categories. So adults, non-urgent, non-invasive, healthcare provider driven only, and the smaller algorithms probably we'll see come to the FDA first. And as those algorithms come, the FDA will improve their practice guidelines, which will slowly decrease the risk of going to the FDA with a more riskier device. So it's going to be a phased-in approach. At least that's the way that it worked in the last generation of AI through FDA. So now I'll talk about the non-medical device route, and specifically, I want to focus back on the FD&C Act that makes provisions to exclude devices, including the device software functions, excluding the pursuant 520.0, which there's 4 components to this. The first criteria is that the software component is not intended to acquire, process, or analyze medical images or signals from an in vitro device. So if you don't want your product to be considered a medical device, you can't process images. So that will probably exclude multimodal networks, probably like text to video. It's probably going to exclude those types of those cases, but also subtly, it may exclude cases where you're analyzing a time series, like if you converted an ECG signal into the voltage pattern and fed that as like a spreadsheet into a large language model, that would still be considered processing a signal. So those would put you into medical device territory. Not saying you can't do them, but you will have to go through FDA clearance for something like that. So the second criteria is it's intended for displaying, analyzing, and printing medical information or other information. When I read this first, it just didn't really make any sense to me. But the FDA has put out a guidance on the FDA's interpretation of the regulation, and there they state that number 2 is meant to be interpreted. Is this information verbally or in a written format communicated between healthcare providers in normal clinical practice? So, for example, healthcare providers do communicate things like pulse rate, sodium concentration, diabetes, or hemoglobin H1C, but they don't communicate pixels on a screen, or they don't communicate, back to my previous example, voltage waveforms on an EKG. Maybe they'll say that the heart rate was this, or that the heart rate variability was this, but they're not going to say that it was 5 volts here and 10 volts, 10 milliseconds later. So that it kind of is saying, or it's adding more color to number 1 about what is considered a signal or an image. So number 3 is that it's intended for the purpose of providing recommendations, but not replacing the healthcare professional. And also, there is a lot of interpretation that happens here. Now, what exactly is supporting versus replacing? What exactly is recommendation versus driving? And I'll give some examples about that in a little bit. So the FDA in their interpretation of Criterion 3, the recommendation to the healthcare provider is limited to informing or influencing healthcare decision, but not intended to replace. And they also say that things like time-critical decision making, the physician does not have enough time to be able to be influenced by the AI. They can only there's only enough time to replace their judgment. So there's this concept of automation bias, and certain device indications that would bias the clinician too much would push them into med device territory. And there's several ways that can happen. The time critical way is one way where the bias is too great, where the FDA considers, that should probably be something that would need to be reviewed by FDA. Or if you narrow the differential diagnosis down too much, humans are susceptible to confirmation bias. If you see one diagnosis, it's really easy to ignore other bits of evidence that would disprove that hypothesis. So those are two ways, like practically how that would correspond to if you have a product that had large language models. Like instead of giving one suggestion for a disease state, maybe you'd give 5 suggestions, maybe the top 5 instead of just the one. So the top 5 would likely push you into the non-device category, versus the top 1 probably is going to push you into the medical device territory. Now, there is no hard and fast rule about where that threshold happens. If there was, I guess I wouldn't have a job. But the best way to get advice from the FDA, definitely do a FDA pre-submission meeting if you want to know their opinion about a regulatory strategy. It's free. It's something that we can also help you do if you have questions there. And the fourth one is I think kind of sticky, and that back to the poll that I'd mentioned earlier, some of the regulations might have to change to adapt. This might be the one that needs to change. So number 4 says it needs to enable the healthcare professional to independently review the basis for such recommendations. So what that would mean from the generative AI standpoint, the AI would have to explain why it got the results, not just the diagnosis, but it would need to explain where it got it from, and it would need to be able to cite the sources. And as we'll see in some other examples, it would also have to give examples about what data was used to train to come up with that decision. It would have to explain all of that. And I think this would be the most difficult point to satisfy if you're trying to go down the non-device route. It's still unclear exactly what the interpretation of this is once generative AI kind of becomes a bit more mainstream in the med device realm. So here's some examples of non-medical devices. So the first one is a product or an app that does evidence-based clinician ordering sets for a particular condition or disease. So this is like, for this disease, you need to order a CT angiogram of the head. Notice they say order sets and not just one. This is also going back to you don't want to narrow the focus down too much. And another product is a product that will give any sort of contextually relevant information about a disease or condition. So think of it this is summarizing the practice guidelines. that's also not a device. So if you have a chatbot that looks through the up-to-date website, or it looks through looks through body of research knowledge as an educational or reference tool, it's probably not going to be considered a medical device. Also, if it's a prioritized list, you notice again this example, it's a list, it's not just one, and you can prioritize them, but not have just one. So here's an example of a medical device that may not be obvious at first glance. So suppose we have a product that identifies patients with a possible opioid addiction based on analysis of the patient's medical record, family history, prescriptions, and geographic data. The FDA would actually consider this a device because it provides a specific diagnosis or treatment outcome. So if your product identifies a product, will find a patient that has possible opioid addiction, that's just once. So you're like narrowing the differential diagnosis of that patient down to one. You are causing the healthcare provider to be overly biased to that diagnosis. And now they're just going to be thinking, oh, maybe opioid addiction, and they might ignore the ST elevation for like a heart attack, right? So that would go into med device territory. Also, another one here that may not be obvious: if you have a product that uses generative AI, for example, to estimate how much insulin to give to a diabetic patient. I mean, first of all, it is being reported to a patient that could be problematic. But also, the important thing here that the FDA points out is this time-critical decision-making. So the idea is that whenever you're dosing for insulin, the healthcare provider or the patient does not have enough time to really double-check that result. And even then, like the FDA considers this time critical. Is it hours? Is it minutes? There isn't really a set time there, but this gives you an idea of one case where it would be considered time critical. And so here's kind of one more that is not as obvious. Or I certainly didn't think it was obvious. So if the software function provides a prioritized list, check, for FDA authorized depression treatment used by a healthcare provider, reported on a database of clinical studies. So this all sounding pretty good. And in the intended use statement for the device, the population is clearly identified. It's not time critical, so that's also good. And there is enough time for the HCP, being this is going to be in like an outpatient setting. There's enough time for them to really research and really chew on the information that was provided to them. However, this still is not exempt from the FDA because of this step here, where the software does not identify studies that are most closely matched patient-specific diagnosis and demographics. And so just entering this information into ChatGPT is likely not going to be okay. Perhaps some sort of retrieval augmented generation thing where you can show what you retrieved and what went into that final prompt, that may be sufficient. I'm not aware of any precedent. I'm going either way, and that would likely, to be on the safest side, be something that we want to discuss with the FDA, see what their stance is on that kind of use case. But you can kind of see how, if your goal is to not be a medical device, you might want to re-architect and re-engineer your product to fit into all of these criteria. I realize that I'm really late on time, so I'll be kind of going through these. This is a flowchart that I designed. If you want your product not to be a medical device, you can go through this flowchart and you can tell exactly what is a device and what it's not. For the purposes of time, I'm not going to go into each one of these branches, but I summarized the FDA's guidance.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. I was gonna say you're great on time. If you want to keep going,
Oh, sure,
I'm
sure. Okay.
sure we had a little glitch in that people are having to go to my page to be able to see this, but it's all on YouTube and Twitter live. So just keep going, take your time, and go at your pace. So I'm gonna go back down.
Okay, great, great. So if your intended user is a patient and your product is not low risk, and we can kind of go into that might be an entire topic on itself, but here's an example. Low risk, if you calculate insulin food, that's high risk. If you just give personalized diet advice, that's low risk. So if your device is not low risk, then it is most likely going to be considered a medical device. It is subject to FDA regulation. If the product is intended to be used to maintain or encourage a general state of well-being and not particularly targeted to any particular health condition, then it is not a medical device. Otherwise, if the product is targeted to a particular medical condition, for example, if you say, this might help manage diabetes, you have to say on your product it may reduce or it may help with living. You can't definitively say that. If your product says that in its labeling, it's not a medical device. If it doesn't say it, it is a medical device. So the burden of proof goes up. Otherwise, kind of a catch-all at the end. If it doesn't fall in any of these categories, it probably is a medical device. That is common in FDA is that the device is higher risk until it's proven to be lower. So it's a conservative approach. Otherwise, if your intended target is a healthcare provider, if your product is only used for educational purposes, it's not a medical device. It's used for research, but it's not tied to a particular patient situation, it's probably not a medical device. If it analyzes signals, it's a medical device. If it would have to communicate using things that most physicians don't communicate, it's a device. If it's too specific a recommendation, it's a device. If it's unable to provide clear explanations for how it came out to that explanation, it's a device. And if your training data is not entirely known, it's probably a device. And I know that last one is probably going to be very difficult to do, just given that only the big tech companies really have access to that data and can train that data. So certainly something there would probably need to change, and there would need to be some precedent to FDA to change that last one. But anyway, so some other non-device scenarios that weren't mentioned here. So practice of medicine. So the FDA does not regulate practice of medicine, which is how physicians practice medicine. So the FDA can't tell a physician you can't use ChatGPT to help you diagnose, as long as ChatGPT doesn't make any specific claims, which they don't. This can still be used by physicians as part of their daily workflow. There's obviously other potential problems with that, not to mention patient privacy issues, also liability issues. In that case, the physician is taking on the liability of like hallucination, causing some sort of malpractice. Whereas if ChatGPT were a medical device, that liability would be shared. And another kind of way far out there, kind of just a thought experiment. The FDA doesn't regulate state licensing boards. What if that's a pathway? Just recently, a paper came out by Google, this model called Amy, that they showed that Amy could generate a more accurate differential diagnosis list than a clinician. Obviously, you have to go read the paper. I think there's probably lots of strings attached to this kind of analysis here, but it's showing that possibly for this particular experimental setup, the algorithm outperformed the algorithm plus clinician. So in that case, what if this algorithm sat for the state medical board and it passed it? Would would that be a way to potentially would that be the scenario where generative AI comes into common medical practice? I don't know. This is a thought experiment. Um, but anyway, that concludes my presentation. So I'll take any questions here. Thanks for thanks for listening. And yeah, happy to entertain any questions.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your time, your expertise. I'm going to highly encourage anybody out there to call you, and if they have any questions in this realm, which this is changing so much. So even if you answer something today, I could see this changing in 3 months and being another answer. So that's the crazy part. Um, I'm gonna have some questions here, and I'll ask you this one, and it's kind of long, but the skinny is this. If you know anything about Glass Health, they just announced yesterday that they now have a new clinical chatbot that basically is used for physicians to help them with any clinical reference. On their Glass Health LinkedIn page, actually give an example of when a patient should be treated for acute appendicitis. This is non-legal advice. I'm just curious, from your opinion,
Sure.
what do you think of this? Would this be something that the FDA would have to look at, or because this is just for physicians and you have to prove yourself to physicians?
Yeah, I think there's and definitely this is not going to be a black and white. It's always going to be kind of gray, how it's interpreted. Um, I mean, the things that are going in favor of not being a device is that it's being used by healthcare clinician. It seems like it's going to be generating some suggestions based on the body of clinical practice guidelines, perhaps, so not anything specific. And you'd be able to reference those and exactly like here's the paper where we got it from.
Yeah.
I would presume that could be how it's implemented. That would definitely push you into the non-device category. But something tugging you in the other direction is that if it's acute appendicitis, then this is going to be definitely more time intensive. And is it urgent? Um, so I don't know. I can probably assign a probability to it. Like I would think 80% chance that it's not advice, but definitely I would encourage you to reach out to FDA perhaps to get a more definitive answer on that, if it is considered a
Awesome.
device or not.
And then now to kind of keep it balanced, on the patient side, if a company uses RAG AI technology and basically they're talking about medical topic X, let's just use the example of diabetes since you said it. Um, would that be considered a medical advice? Basically, think of it as going into a website. It's got these different databases, and then this particular one, they're focused on diabetes. A patient knows that this is AI. It's
Mhm,
how would
mhm.
this be considered a medical device, or would they have to put a disclaimer saying, "Hey, this is not medical advice; it's just educational"?
So let's just kind of go down this program. So if the user is a patient, which it is,
Yeah.
if the product is not low risk. So again, it really depends on what advice you're giving to patients and how those patients are expected to act on that advice. So for the case of diabetes tech, if it's just trying to prevent or trying to manage diabetes from like a lifestyle modification, diet, intermittent fasting, that's probably in non-device territory. But if it's something like suggesting insulin, something higher risk, where
Mhm.
the patient may have chance for harm, and that definitely swings you into medical device territory. This could also be a general state of health, like if you're just helping to improve, like patients saying, I have hey doc, I have hypertension and hyperlipidemia, and I have all the classic Western kind of disease. How can I improve my general health? That's not medical device territory. That's what the FDA calls a general wellness device. Um, and also you probably have this on your marketing materials already, but definitely say may help reduce, or definitely put a qualifier on that. It's not a bad idea to say that this is not a device. It's not to be meant to replace your primary care physician. These are all good things to have.
Awesome. No, excellent, excellent. No, this is really informative. In fact, so good that I know I'm going to personally watch this over again because there's just so much information. I love these two
Right.
charts.
Thanks.
I'm going to encourage people to reach out to you. And then if you would like to share your slides, please let me know. And then I can put them up on LinkedIn and I can make a little slideshow out of them, especially these two last slides. Not that all of them are amazing, but I think those two
Sure. Yeah.
really, it's the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know what happened. I had a glitch, but I'm seeing tons of viewers on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter. There's about over 60 right now just on
Sure.
LinkedIn. So highly encourage you. I just got one says this was great. Thank you so much. And we don't
Thanks.
know who
You're
it
welcome.
was, but thank you for for responding there. Do you have anything else you want to share? Do you want to give your website again or any other information how we can get a hold of you or your LinkedIn?
Yeah, if you can just reach out to my LinkedIn, you see have my name there, Yujan Shrestha, or you can just go to our website at analytics.com. That's INNOLITICS.com. You can just smash the contact us button there. We also have a lot of resources on our website, and I'll make these slides available on our website as well. So here you can learn things about how to submit to FDA, how to take an AI idea to FDA, and just a whole lot of technical documents. Or you can just hire us if you don't want to read them. That would be fine too. But yeah,
Well, awesome,
that's
sir. Well,
all.
I appreciate you, and then I'd love to have you back again. And if we could do anything to support you and your cause, I really appreciate what you're doing. So thank you, Doc.
Yeah, definitely, and definitely thanks a lot, Harvey, for this opportunity. Yeah, definitely looking forward to a lot more in the future. So.
Awesome. Well, stand by, buddy. I'm just gonna close the show out, and then give me 2 seconds.